You should walk away while you still think this is a joke. The laughter came anyway, loud and careless, cutting through the dry afternoon air like a revving engine pushed too hard. Chrome flashed under the sun. A row of bikes lined across the gravel lot outside a roadside diner off Route 17, their polished frames reflecting heat in shimmering waves. The smell of gasoline and hot asphalt hung thick, mixing with the distant sizzle of burgers on a flat-top grill. Arthur Hale stood near the edge of it all, one hand resting lightly on a worn wooden cane, the other hanging loose at his side. He looked small against the machines, against the men who circled him, but there was nothing fragile in the way he held himself. His posture was steady, his breathing even, his pale blue eyes quiet and unreadable. Derek Cole, the one with the loudest voice and the easiest grin, stepped closer, boots crunching against the gravel with deliberate weight. "You hear that, boys?" he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Old man thinks he's giving us orders." A few chuckles rolled through the group, low and amused, the kind of laughter that fed on itself. Arthur didn't respond. He didn't shift his stance or tighten his grip. If anything, he seemed to settle further into stillness, like a man listening to something far beyond the noise in front of him. One of the younger bikers leaned against his ride, arms crossed, studying Arthur with a flicker of curiosity that didn't quite fit the mood. It was brief, half a second at most, but enough to notice something didn't add up. There was no fear in the old man's face. No irritation, not even resignation, just a calm that didn't belong in a moment like this. Derek reached out and tapped the cane with the toe of his boot, not hard, just enough to make a point. "You lost, old-timer?" he asked, voice dropping into something sharper, less playful. "This ain't exactly a place for whatever you are." The group tightened around Arthur, a loose circle closing by inches, the sound of engines ticking as they cooled filling the gaps between voices. Somewhere inside the diner, a bell chimed as the door opened, but no one outside turned to look. Arthur's gaze moved slowly from one face to another, not judging, not challenging, simply seeing. When he spoke again, his voice was low, rough with age but steady as stone. "You should walk away." The words didn't rise. They didn't push. They just settled into the air, heavier than they had any right to be. Derek smirked, shaking his head as if amused by the audacity. "Or what?" he asked, spreading his hand slightly. "You gonna call someone?" A couple of the men laughed again, but it didn't carry the same ease. That brief flicker of doubt had spread, thin as a crack in glass. Arthur didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence that followed stretched just a second too long, just enough for something unseen to press in around them, something that didn't belong to engines or heat or bravado. And for the first time, one of the bikers shifted his weight, glancing toward the empty road beyond the lot as if expecting something, or someone, to already be on their way. The moment stretched, thin and fragile, like glass under pressure. The engines had gone quiet now, leaving behind only the faint ticking of cooling metal and the distant hum of traffic rolling down the highway a quarter-mile away. Derek's grin held, but it had lost something, a small piece of certainty slipping through the cracks. He took a step closer, closing the distance until he stood just inside Arthur Hale's space, testing, measuring. "You got some nerve," he said, his voice lower now, less for the crowd and more for himself. "Standing here like you are not outnumbered." Arthur did not move. The wind brushed lightly across the lot, carrying dust in soft spirals that curled around boots and tires. His coat shifted slightly with it, revealing the edge of a thin chain resting against his collarbone, something small and metallic catching a brief glint of sunlight before disappearing again beneath the fabric. One of the bikers noticed it. "What is that?" he muttered, nodding toward Arthur's chest. Derek followed the glance, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. "Some kind of tag?" he said, reaching out, not fast, not aggressive, just casual enough to make it seem harmless. Arthur's hand lifted, not to stop him, but to rest lightly over the object, a quiet barrier. "You should not touch that," he said, his tone unchanged, steady, almost gentle. Derek paused for a fraction of a second, then smiled wider, the kind of smile that thrived on ignoring warnings. "Yeah," he said softly, "I think I will." His fingers brushed past Arthur's hand, catching the chain and pulling it free just enough for the small metal tag to fall into view. It was not polished. It was not impressive. Just a dull piece of steel, worn by time, its edges softened, its surface marked by years that had left no clear explanation behind. Derek turned it slightly, squinting at the faint engraving as if expecting something obvious, something that would justify the moment. "Looks like scrap," he said, letting it hang loosely between his fingers. Around them, the circle tightened again, drawn in by curiosity more than mockery now. The younger biker, the one who had hesitated before, shifted closer, his eyes fixed on Arthur instead of the tag. There was something in the old man's expression that had changed, not outwardly, not in any way that could be pointed at, but in the way the air around him seemed to settle, heavier, more deliberate. Arthur did not reach for the tag. He did not argue. He simply watched Derek, his gaze steady, as if measuring time instead of distance. Inside the diner, Emily Carter stood frozen behind the counter, a coffee pot in her hand, her attention pulled entirely to the scene outside. She had seen arguments before, loud voices, bad attitudes, people passing through with more ego than sense. But this felt different. The stillness of the old man did not match the situation. It did not match the men surrounding him. It did not match anything she understood. Her eyes dropped briefly to the counter where a small card lay near the register, something that had slipped from Arthur's pocket earlier when he had reached for his wallet. She had picked it up without thinking, intending to return it, but now she stared at the number printed on it. Simple, unremarkable, except for the words beneath it that made her chest tighten for reasons she could not explain. Outside, Derek let the tag fall back against Arthur's chest with a soft metallic click. "That it," he said, stepping back half a pace. "That your big warning?" Arthur's eyes did not follow the movement. They stayed where they were, calm, unwavering, as if the moment had already passed for him. "You still have time," he said quietly. And this time, no one laughed. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling over the gravel lot like a low-pressure front before a storm, subtle but impossible to ignore. Derek exhaled through his nose, a quiet, controlled sound, and glanced around at the others as if expecting someone to fill the gap Arthur had left behind. No one did. Boots shifted. A jacket creaked. Somewhere behind them, a loose license plate rattled softly in the breeze. "You hear that?" one of the bikers muttered, though there was nothing to hear except the absence of noise. Derek shook his head slightly, as if clearing something he did not want to acknowledge, and turned back. "You keep saying that," he said, his voice measured now, less sharp, more deliberate. "Time for what?" Arthur's gaze drifted past him for just a moment, toward the open stretch of road cutting through the flat landscape beyond the diner, 2 lanes of sun-bleached asphalt stretching for miles in both directions. "For you to make a better decision," he replied. The words landed differently this time, not as a warning, but as a statement already made too late. The younger biker swallowed, his eyes following Arthur's for a second before snapping back. "Man, this is weird," he said under his breath, too low for Derek, but not low enough to disappear. Derek heard it anyway. He always did. His jaw tightened. "Nothing is weird," he said, louder than necessary. "It is just an old man trying to sound important." But even as he spoke, his eyes flicked once more toward the highway. Just a glance, quick and involuntary. It was empty, completely empty. No cars, no trucks, just heat rippling above the pavement. Inside the diner, Emily Carter set the coffee pot down without realizing she had done it. Her hand hovered above the counter, fingers slightly curled, as if still holding something that was no longer there. Her attention had split between the window and the card in front of her, the number printed in clean black ink, the words beneath it echoing in her mind in a way that made no sense. She picked it up again, turning it over once, twice, as if the motion might reveal something hidden. It did not. It was just a number, but it did not feel like just a number. Her thumb hovered over her phone. She hesitated. Outside, the air shifted again, a faint gust rolling across the lot, lifting dust and carrying it in a thin line toward the road. Arthur closed his eyes for half a second, just long enough to feel it, just long enough for something old and distant to brush against the present. The smell of hot asphalt faded, replaced by something sharper, something metallic and dry, a memory that did not belong to this place. The sound of engines returned, but not these engines, not the uneven idle of customized bikes. These were different, synchronized, controlled, cutting clean through the air with purpose. He opened his eyes again. The lot came back into focus, the circle of men, the sun, the diner, all exactly where they had been. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had already moved forward. Derek took another step back, not enough to be obvious, just enough to create space he had not wanted before. "Look," he said, lifting his hands slightly, palms out in a gesture that tried to reclaim control. "We are just talking here. Nobody is doing anything." No one answered him. The younger biker glanced again at the road, longer this time, his unease no longer hidden. "You ever get that feeling," he said quietly, "like something is about to happen?" Derek did not respond. He did not need to, because at that exact moment, far down the highway, just beyond the bend where the heat blurred everything into a wavering mirage, something did move, small at first, almost invisible against the shimmer, but steady, precise, and unmistakably on its way. The shimmer on the horizon held for a moment, barely more than a distortion in the heat, the kind of mirage drivers ignored after miles of empty road. But this one did not fade. It sharpened, resolving into movement that did not belong to chance or coincidence. The younger biker saw it first, his head tilting slightly, eyes narrowing against the glare. "Hey," he said, not loud, just enough to pull attention without meaning to. Derek followed his gaze, his expression tightening as he focused on the distant line. At first it looked like two dark shapes moving in perfect alignment, low and steady, not weaving, not drifting, just advancing with a precision that felt out of place on a road like this. The sound came next, not the uneven rumble of motorcycles or the high whine of passing traffic, but something deeper, controlled, engines tuned to purpose rather than noise. It carried across the open space in a way that seemed deliberate, as if it was meant to be heard before it was fully seen. Arthur Hale did not turn his head. He did not need to. His eyes remained forward, his posture unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in his breathing, a small release, like a man marking the end of a long wait rather than the beginning of something new. Derek crossed his arms, trying to anchor himself in the familiar, in the role he had already claimed. "Probably nothing," he said, though his voice lacked the ease it had carried minutes ago. No one answered him. The group had gone quiet again, but this time it was different. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with attention, every man now watching the road, tracking the approach of whatever was coming. Inside the diner, Emily Carter's hesitation broke. Her thumb pressed down, dialing the number on the card with emotion that felt both sudden and inevitable. The line rang once. That was all. A voice answered, calm, direct, without greeting or question. "Go ahead." Emily swallowed, her eyes flicking to the window where the figures outside had shifted, their focus now pulled away from Arthur and toward the road. "There is a man out here," she said, her voice low but steady. "His name is Arthur Hale." There was a pause, not long, just enough to register the words. Then the tone on the other end changed, not louder, not urgent, but sharpened, like a blade being drawn. "Stay where you are," the voice said. "Do not engage. We are already moving." The line went dead. Emily lowered the phone slowly, her hand no longer shaking, replaced by a strange, quiet certainty she could not explain. Outside, the shapes on the road had grown larger, now clearly vehicles, dark, unmarked, their surfaces absorbing the sunlight instead of reflecting it. They did not slow as they approached the diner. They did not hesitate. They moved with intent, closing the distance in seconds that felt stretched thin by anticipation. Derek uncrossed his arms without realizing he had done it. One of the bikers took a step back, then another, the movement subtle but contagious. The circle that had once tightened around Arthur began to loosen, not by decision, but by instinct. The vehicles turned into the lot without a signal, tires crunching over gravel with controlled force, engines cutting almost immediately after, leaving behind a sudden, heavy quiet that pressed against the air. The doors opened in unison, not rushed, not slow, just precise. Men stepped out, their movements efficient, their presence carrying a weight that did not need explanation. Arthur finally turned his head, just slightly, his gaze settling on them, as if confirming something he had known all along. And in that moment, before a single word was spoken, the balance of the entire scene shifted completely. The gravel settled slowly beneath their boots as the last echoes of the engines faded into nothing, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt deliberate, as if the air itself had chosen to hold its breath. The men who stepped out of the vehicles did not rush, did not posture, did not speak. They moved with a quiet precision that did not need explanation, their presence alone enough to redraw the boundaries of the moment. Derek's shoulders straightened instinctively, his chin lifting just slightly as he tried to recalibrate, to understand what he was looking at without admitting that he did not. "Who are these guys?" one of the bikers whispered, the edge of confidence in his voice now replaced with something thinner, less certain. No one answered. The figures approached with measured steps, boots pressing into the gravel with soft, controlled sounds that carried farther than they should have. Their clothing was simple, unmarked, but everything about them spoke of discipline, of coordination, of something built over years rather than moments. The man in front stopped a few feet from Arthur Hale. He did not look at Derek. He did not acknowledge the circle that had once formed around the old veteran. His attention went exactly where it belonged. His posture shifted, straightening with a subtle but unmistakable formality. Then, without hesitation, he raised his hand in a clean, deliberate motion. The salute was sharp, precise, and absolute. "Sir," he said, his voice calm, steady, carrying just enough to be heard by everyone standing in that lot. "Apologies for the delay." The words landed harder than any shout could have. Derek blinked, once, then again, as if trying to clear a picture that refused to make sense. His eyes moved from the man in front of Arthur to the others behind him, taking in their stance, their spacing, the way they watched everything without appearing to look at anything in particular. It was not aggression. It was not threat. It was something far more unsettling. It was control. Arthur inclined his head slightly, the smallest acknowledgement, as if this were a routine exchange, as if none of what had just happened required explanation. "You are on time," he replied quietly. The leader lowered his hand, his gaze steady, respectful, never drifting. Only then did he shift, just enough to let his attention pass briefly over the group of bikers. It was not a glare. It was not a challenge. It was a simple, measured look that seemed to assess everything in a single second and find it already resolved. Derek felt it without understanding why. His chest tightened, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden realization that whatever balance he thought he held had never existed at all. "We did not know," Derek said, the words coming out before he could stop them, softer than he intended, stripped of the edge they had carried before. The man did not respond to him. He did not need to. His focus returned to Arthur, his voice lowering slightly, meant only for him now, but still heard by everyone in the stillness. "Do you require anything, sir?" Arthur shook his head once, slow and certain. "No," he said. "They are leaving." It was not a suggestion. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. And as if the words themselves carried weight, the circle broke completely. One by one, the bikers stepped back, boots scraping against gravel, hands lowering, shoulders loosening, each man finding space where before there had been none. No one argued. No one laughed. The moment had passed them by, and they knew it. Derek hesitated a second longer than the others, his gaze lingering on Arthur, searching for something he could hold on to, something that would make sense of it all. He found nothing but that same quiet, unshakable calm. And in that silence, he understood more than any explanation could have given him. He turned, stepping back toward his bike, the sound of his boots no longer carrying confidence, but something closer to respect. The engines did not start right away, and that was what made it real. The bikers did not rush, did not throw out last words or forced laughter to reclaim something that was already gone. They moved in silence, each man returning to his machine with a kind of quiet awareness, as if the air itself had shifted into something that demanded restraint. Derek reached his bike last, his hand resting on the handlebar without immediately gripping it, his gaze drifting back once more to Arthur Hale. The old man had not moved. He stood exactly where he had been, one hand still on the worn cane, the other relaxed at his side, his posture unchanged despite everything that had unfolded around him. The men who had arrived stood nearby, not crowding him, not surrounding him, but positioned with a subtle geometry that spoke of instinct and training, their presence forming a perimeter that did not need to be announced. Derek cleared his throat, the sound dry in the heavy stillness. "We are leaving," he said, more to himself than anyone else, as if the words needed to be spoken out loud to become real. No one challenged him. One by one, the bikes came to life, engines turning over with low, controlled rumbles that felt smaller now, less dominant than they had before. The sound rose, but it did not fill the space the same way. It stayed contained, almost respectful. The younger biker hesitated before starting his engine, his eyes lingering on Arthur, searching for something, a signal, a reaction, anything that would bridge the gap between what had happened and what it meant. Arthur met his gaze for a brief moment, a quiet acknowledgement that held no anger, no triumph, only a steady, grounded presence. It was enough. The younger man nodded once, almost unconsciously, then turned his key. Within seconds, the group began to roll out, tires pressing into the gravel in a slow, controlled departure, not fleeing, not retreating, simply leaving. Derek was the last to go. He swung his leg over the seat, paused again, then finally looked back one last time. "Sir," he said, the word unfamiliar on his tongue, but not forced, not sarcastic, just accurate. Arthur gave the slightest inclination of his head. Derek did not wait for more. He eased the throttle, and the bike moved forward, joining the others as they pulled onto the road and disappeared into the wide, empty stretch beyond the diner. The sound of their engines faded gradually, dissolving into the distance until there was nothing left but the wind and the quiet hum of the world returning to itself. For a moment, no one spoke. The men who had arrived remained where they were, their attention still outward, scanning, aware, even as the tension drained from the space. Then, slowly, the leader stepped closer to Arthur, his posture easing just enough to shift from operational to personal. "Area is clear," he said, his voice low, measured. Arthur nodded once, his hand adjusting slightly on the cane as if grounding himself back into the present. "It was never about the area," he replied softly. The man studied him for a second, then allowed the faintest hint of understanding to pass through his expression. Inside the diner, Emily Carter finally moved, stepping out from behind the counter and toward the door, her heart still beating faster than it should, her mind trying to catch up with what she had just witnessed. She pushed the door open, the bell chiming softly above her as she stepped into the sunlight. The heat hit her immediately, but it felt different now, lighter somehow, as if something heavy had been lifted without anyone saying it out loud. She approached slowly, stopping a few feet away, unsure of where she fit into what had just happened. Arthur turned slightly toward her, his expression unchanged, calm, steady, but there was a softness there now, something that had not been visible before. "You made the call," he said, not asking, simply stating it. Emily nodded, her voice catching just slightly. "I did not know who else to call." Arthur gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You called the right place." The air did not rush back in all at once. It returned slowly, like a tide easing back over ground that had been held too long. And with it came the ordinary sounds of the world, the faint buzz of insects in the dry grass, the distant hum of a passing truck miles down the highway, the soft creak of the diner door as it settled on its hinges behind Emily Carter. But the space around Arthur Hale still carried something different, something that did not belong to the heat or the dust or the empty road stretching in both directions. The men who had arrived remained in place for a moment longer, not because they needed to, but because that was how they operated, ensuring the absence of a problem with the same precision they had brought to its resolution. The leader shifted his stance slightly, his gaze moving once more across the lot, not searching, simply confirming. "We will hold for 2 minutes," he said quietly, not as an order, but as a statement understood by the others. No one responded. They did not need to. Arthur adjusted his grip on the cane again, the motion subtle, almost habitual, as if grounding himself back into the rhythm of the present after something that had briefly stretched beyond it. Emily stood a few feet away, unsure whether to step closer or remain where she was, her mind still catching fragments of what she had witnessed, trying to place them into a shape that made sense. "Are they?" she began, then stopped, the question unfinished because she did not know how to ask it. Arthur turned his head slightly toward her, his expression calm, the same quiet steadiness that had been there from the beginning. "They are what they need to be," he said, his voice low, measured, carrying a weight that suggested the answer was both simple and complete. Emily nodded slowly, though she was not sure she understood. The leader stepped closer then, just within arm's length of Arthur, his posture easing further, the edge of formality softening into something more personal. "We received the call immediately," he said. "Your name triggered a direct channel." Arthur's eyes met his for a brief second, something unspoken passing between them, a recognition that did not need explanation. "It always does," Arthur replied quietly. The man gave a slight nod, accepting the statement without question. Around them, the other operators had shifted subtly, their formation loosening, their attention no longer fixed outward but still aware, still present, as if the line between readiness and rest was something they carried with them at all times. The wind picked up again, brushing across the lot, lifting small trails of dust that moved in quiet arcs before settling back into place. It carried with it the faint scent of distant rain, though the sky above remained clear, a pale blue stretching uninterrupted to the horizon. Emily glanced at the road, now empty again, the last trace of the bikers long gone, leaving behind nothing but the memory of their presence. "They just left," she said, almost to herself. Arthur followed her gaze for a moment, then returned it to the space in front of him. "They understood," he said. "That is enough." The leader studied him for a second longer, then gave a small, respectful nod, a gesture that held more meaning than any words could carry. "We will stand down," he said. Arthur inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the decision. The men moved without hurry, turning back toward the vehicles with the same quiet precision they had arrived with, doors opening and closing in controlled motions, engines starting with low, steady hums that did not disturb the calm that had settled over the scene. Emily watched them go, her breath slowing, her thoughts finally beginning to align with what she had seen. Arthur remained where he was, the sun casting a long shadow behind him, his figure steady against the open space, as if nothing had happened at all. And yet, everything had changed. The vehicles did not linger, and that was the final confirmation that nothing here required further action. One by one, they rolled out of the gravel lot with the same measured precision they had arrived with, engines low and controlled, tires pressing shallow tracks into the dust before finding the asphalt again. No sirens, no flashing lights, no spectacle. Within seconds, they were just part of the road, blending into the horizon until even the sound of their engines dissolved into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt earned rather than empty. Emily Carter stood still for a moment longer, watching the stretch of highway, as if expecting something else to follow, something louder, something more explainable, but nothing came. Just open road and heat shimmering in the afternoon sun. She turned back slowly, her eyes finding Arthur Hale again, and for the first time since she had stepped outside, she truly saw him, not as the center of a strange and overwhelming moment, but as a man standing quietly in a place that had already begun to forget what had just happened. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice softer now, no urgency, just a simple, human question. Arthur nodded once, the motion small but certain. "I am fine," he said. He adjusted the collar of his coat slightly, the chain with the worn metal tag settling back into place against his chest, hidden once more from view as if it had never been revealed at all. Emily hesitated, then took a step closer, her curiosity finally finding a path forward. "Who were they?" she asked, the question carrying more weight than the words themselves. Arthur looked past her for a moment, toward the diner, toward the world that continued, as if untouched. "Men doing their job," he replied. It was not the answer she expected, and yet something about the way he said it made it feel complete. Inside the diner, a couple of customers had returned to their meals, their conversations low and cautious, as if speaking too loudly might bring the moment back. The bell above the door chimed faintly as a breeze pushed it open just enough to move, then let it fall closed again. Arthur shifted his weight, testing the ground with the tip of his cane before taking a slow step forward, then another, each movement deliberate but steady. Emily walked beside him without thinking, matching his pace as they moved toward the diner entrance. "I almost called 911, she said after a moment, her voice thoughtful. Arthur glanced at her briefly. "But you did not," he said. She shook her head. "That number, it felt like the right one." Arthur gave a faint, knowing nod. "It was They reached the door, and for a second, both of them paused, the ordinary world waiting just beyond the glass, the smell of coffee and cooked food drifting out to meet them. Emily reached for the handle but stopped, turning back one last time to look at the empty lot, the place where everything had shifted so completely and then disappeared without a trace. "Does that happen a lot?" she asked quietly. Arthur followed her gaze, his eyes resting on the space where the bikes had been, where the vehicles had stopped, where the air had held something heavier than words. He considered the question for a moment, not dismissing it, not rushing it. "No," he said finally. "Only when it needs to." Emily nodded slowly, accepting the answer even if she did not fully understand it. Arthur opened the door, the bell chiming softly as they stepped back inside, the sound clear and simple, cutting through the last of the tension like a line drawn between what had been and what would continue. Outside, the wind moved again across the empty gravel, lifting dust that settled just as quickly, leaving no mark of what had happened there, no sign that anything had ever been out of place. And in that quiet absence, the truth remained, steady and unspoken, carried not in what people saw, but in what they chose never to forget. The diner felt smaller when they stepped back inside, not because anything had changed, but because everything outside had stretched the space in a way that ordinary walls could not contain. The soft hum of conversation returned in cautious fragments, forks tapping lightly against plates, coffee cups settling back onto worn wooden tables. Life resumed, but not completely. Something lingered, subtle but present, like the echo of a sound that refused to fully fade. Arthur Hale moved toward a booth near the window, the same one he had occupied before, his steps slow but steady, the rhythm of his cane marking time against the floor in quiet, deliberate taps. Emily Carter followed a step behind, her eyes still drifting occasionally toward the glass, half expecting the horizon to shift again, half hoping it would not. Arthur eased himself into the seat with practiced care, his posture settling into a stillness that felt natural, as if the weight of the moment outside had never touched him at all. Emily stood there for a second, unsure, then slid into the seat across from him without asking, the question in her eyes already forming. "That number," she said softly, her voice low enough to keep the moment contained between them. "It knew who you were." Arthur did not answer right away. He reached for the coffee cup left behind, the liquid inside still warm, a thin line of steam rising into the quiet air. He took a slow sip, setting it back down with the same measured control he had shown outside. "It recognizes a name," he said finally. Emily leaned forward slightly, her curiosity no longer hesitant, but careful. "That is more than just a name," she said. Arthur's gaze drifted to the window, to the empty lot beyond, where the dust had already settled into stillness, erasing the last visible traces of what had taken place. "Names carry weight," he replied. "Some more than others." Emily studied him, trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the moment she had witnessed, the quiet figure with the unseen reach that had changed everything in less than 20 minutes. "You could have said something," she said. "Back there. You could have told them who you were." Arthur shook his head once, a small, definitive motion. "That would not have helped," he said. "Men like that do not listen to words they do not understand." Emily considered that, her fingers tracing the edge of the table absent-mindedly. "But they understood something," she said. Arthur allowed the faintest hint of a smile to touch his expression, not pride, not satisfaction, just recognition. "Yes," he said quietly. "They understood what matters." The waitress in the far corner called out an order, the sound normal, grounding, pulling the room further back into its familiar rhythm. Outside, a car passed by on the highway, its tires humming steadily over the asphalt, unnoticed by most, but clear enough to mark the return of an ordinary day. Emily exhaled slowly, the tension finally leaving her shoulders. "I'm glad I made that call," she said. Arthur looked at her then, his eyes steady, the weight behind them softened but still present. "So am I," he replied. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was no longer heavy, no longer filled with uncertainty. It was quiet in a different way now, grounded, resolved. Arthur reached up, adjusting his collar once more, the chain beneath it settling against his chest, hidden again, just another part of a life that did not need to be displayed. He picked up his coffee, taking another slow sip, his gaze drifting once more toward the window, toward the road, toward everything that had already moved on. And in that stillness, in that simple, unremarkable moment, the truth remained clear and unspoken. Respect was never something he had asked for. It was something the world eventually remembered on its own.